All right. Does this amplify, or is this just for that? Okay. Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started, I think.
Hey, Don.
Yeah, what?
I said, hey, Don.
Hey, Donna.
Hi.
Hi. First thing I want to do is ask y'all, honestly, tell me, has anyone ever heard of David Brainerd before the emails started going out about that's who I was speaking to tonight? One person. Two people. All right, good. Because I had never heard of him either when I picked him. Josh sent me the list, and it was a list of names, and most of them I had recognized, and I said, well, I don't know who this guy is. And so hopefully when we get done tonight, you'll at least know something about him. But he's known as the most influential and yet little-known figure of the 18th century American evangelism. He was born on April 20th, 1718 in Haddam, Connecticut. His father was a Connecticut legislator, and his parents were devout Christians. His father died when David was 9, and his mother died when he was 14. There seems to have been a strain of depression in their family because he and his 8 siblings all seem to exhibit depression throughout their lifetimes. His diary is his diary, you can Google it and find it online, but it's full of depressing entries. And I'll read you one. It said, was on a Saturday, still in the depths of distress. In the afternoon, preached to my people, but was more discouraged with them than before. Feared that nothing would ever be done for them to any happy effect. I retired and poured out my soul to God for mercy, but without any sensible relief. Soon after came an Irishman and a Dutchman, with a design, as they said, to hear me preach the next day. But none can tell how I felt to hear their profane talk. Oh, I longed that some dear Christian knew my distress. I got into a kind of hovel, and there groaned out my complaint to God, and withal felt more sensible gratitude and thankfulness to God that he made me to differ from these men, as I knew through grace he had. And there are entries like that throughout his diary that was published after his death. He accepted the Lord at age 21, and he is important to missions not because of the length or the success of his work among American Indians, that's who he evangelized, but because of the impact of his story of his life on others, including Jonathan Edwards, a key Great Awakening leader who subsequently published Brainerd's diaries in America, William Carey, Adoram Judson, Henry Martin, Jim Elliot, and even John Wesley in England all credit Brainerd with inspiring them. He was a student in Yale because Harvard was seen to be too theologically liberal at the time. So he went to Yale instead of the conservative college. The impact of the evangelical awakening was being felt among the students there. And during his time at Yale, he heard of Ebenezer Pemberton challenge students about missionary possibilities to the American Indians. Through an unfortunate incident, he was actually expelled from Yale. He was heard, a freshman heard him saying in his junior year that Yale's tutor, Chauncey Whittlesey, I do not believe he has any more grace than the chair I lean upon. He was also accused of saying he was surprised that Rector Thomas Clipp did not drop dead for finding scholars that followed Mr. Tennant. He was asked to publicly apologize for these comments, and he refused to do so because he said he made them in private and he would apologize in private. So he was expelled in his junior year. He was at the top of his class when he was expelled. He did later write a public apology and appeal to be readmitted and asked Jonathan Edwards, who advocated for him, but he was never allowed to graduate. So he immediately applied to Ebenezer Pemberton's mission. Another guy talked to him about American Indians. The Society in Scotland for the Propagation of Christian Knowledge was the organization. And he was appointed as a preacher, not an ordained minister, since he had never graduated from college. He was appointed to work in Connelly. These are long Indian names. Something New York. He then went on to do his own work in the Delaware River Valley, ignorant of the language and the life in the wilderness of New Jersey. And it's not the current wilderness in New Jersey. It's just back in that time, it was a literal wilderness. After a year of fruitless hardship and preaching to the Indians, where David was assigned to the forks of the Delaware River at Pennsylvania-New York border. And that is where a couple of young explorers did overnight canoe trips when I was a little younger. So that's actually the area. It's Hancock, New York, and the border is the Delaware River between New York and Pennsylvania. So there we are. It's still pretty remote, but that was a classic. 1968 Dodge Corvette was a tank. All right, so much for that. He was preserved by God to continue his mission to the Indians there, because Indian braves were sent to kill him. And they went up to his tent and they saw the paleface on his knees praying, and a rattlesnake came into the tent and actually went up to Brainerd, put his head up, and his tongue actually almost touched his face, but Brainerd never knew it. And then the rattlesnake slithered out, and the Indians said that he was the Great Spirit is with this paleface, is what they said. And they treated him as a prophet. So if you can survive a rattlesnake coming up to you and not biting you, I guess you're obviously a sign from God that you're something special. But he was greatly discouraged by the drunken condition of his interpreter, Tatamy. He went on another difficult trip to preach to the Indians in the Susquehanna River, and also proved to be discouraging. After a year, his only converts were Tatamy and his wife. So after a year, he had converted 2 people, and that was his interpreter and his wife. So he began to preach to the Indians at Crossville Weeksung in New Jersey, among whom he had the most remarkable success. And here's another quote from his diary. Spent the morning in reading several parts of the Holy Scripture and in fervent prayer for my Indians, that God would set up his kingdom among them and bring them into his church. About 9, I withdrew to my usual place of retirement in the woods, and there again enjoyed some assistance in prayer. My great concern was for the conversion of the heathen to God, and the Lord helped me to plead with him for it. Towards noon, I rode up to the Indians in order to preach to them, and while going, my heart went up to God in prayer for them. could freely tell God he knew that the cause was not mine, which I was engaged in, but it was his own cause, and it would be for his own glory to convert the poor Indians, and blessed be God. I felt no desire of their conversion, that I might receive honor from the world as being the instrument of it. Had some freedom in speaking to the Indians. So he realized at that point that it wasn't up to him to convert the Indians. He was going to be a tool, but the Lord would have to change their hearts. So his most fruitful ministry to Indians was Crossweksung, or now Crosswicks, New Jersey, which was about 85 miles south of where he was. Within a few weeks, he baptized 20 converts, and shortly thereafter, revival broke out among the Indians. After moving about 130 Indian converts to Cranberry, New Jersey, further revivals brought about a total of 150 more converts. What was interesting about this revival was that Indians that had been converted were the ones greeting the new Indians as they came in. So he had actually created disciples amongst the Indians, and they had Indian pastors, and the Indians were the ones that were carrying it forward. Also, he preached to whites and Indians at the same time, and that was unheard of during that time. The whites had come to the town out of curiosity to see what was going on, and he preached to both the Indians and the whites at the same time. He also put to bed the common thought during that time that Indians or heathens could never be converted. They would never change. So John Piper, who many of you have probably heard of, wrote this about Brainerd's life. It was a short life, 29 years, 5 months, and 19 days. Only 8 of those years as a believer, and only 4 of those as a missionary. Why has Brainerd's life made the impact that it has? One obvious reason is that Jonathan Edwards took the diaries and published them as a life of Brainerd in 1749. But why has this book never been out of print? Why did John Wesley say, "Let every preacher read carefully over the life of Brainerd"? Why was it written of Henry Martin that pursuing the life of David Brainerd, his soul was filled with a holy emulation of that extraordinary man, and after deep consideration and fervent prayer, he was at length fixed in a resolution to imitate his example? Why did William Carey regard Edwards' Life of Brainerd as a sacred text? Why did Robert Morrison and Robert McCheyne of Scotland, and John Mills of America, and Frederick Shorts of Germany, and David Livingstone of England, and Andrew Murray of South Africa, and Jim Elliot of the modern America look upon Brainerd with a kind of awe and drive power from him, the way and countless others did as well? Gideon Hawley, another missionary protege of Jonathan Edwards, spoke for hundreds when he wrote this about his struggles as a missionary in 1753. I greatly need something more than human or natural to support me. I read my Bible on Mr. Brainerd's life, the only book I brought with me, and from there have a little support. Why has this life had such an impact? Or perhaps I should just pose a more modest and manageable question. Why does it have such an impact on me? How has it helped me to press on in the ministry and to strive for holiness and divine power and fruitfulness in my life? The answer for me is that Brainerd's life is a vivid, powerful, testimony to the truth that God can and does use weak, sick, discouraged, beat down, lonely, struggling saints who cry to him day and night to accomplish amazing things for his glory. So John Piper wrote that, and I believe he's still living. So he still has impact on us today. The power of Brainerd's influence in large part lies in the pattern of ministry he adopted, a pattern of service found in the life of the Apostle Paul. The parallels are too numerous to be just a coincidence in how his life mirrored Paul's. He was sick. He had tuberculosis. That's what he died of. But he had that the whole time he was doing his missionary work. He had a mutual and equal commitment to the power of the gospel, the necessity of a clear and undeniable call, and unsurpassing confidence in Christ drove them. As William Carey said, to expect great things from God and to attempt great things for God. J.M. Sherwood said that David Brainerd Sturdy has done more to develop and mold the spirit of modern missions and to fire the heart of the Christian church than that of any man since the apostolic age. He never left New England, but through those he inspired, he has spoken in India, Burma, New Zealand, Persia, and Ecuador, just to name a few. When asked what can be done to revive the word of where it has decayed, John Wesley said, let every preacher read carefully the life of David Brainerd. So he ended up going, he got too sick with tuberculosis, so he couldn't continue his mission any further. So his brother, David, came. He was also ordained, and he came and took over the ministry that he had started in New Jersey with all the Indians. And Brainerd actually made it back to Jonathan Edwards' home, and Edwards and his family had kind of like a ministry of bringing in sick people into their home and taking care of them. So he was cared for by Jonathan Edwards' daughter, and there's unconfirmed rumors that he was in love with her, but she cared for him until he died, and he died of tuberculosis at the ripe old age of 29. And now after his death, Edwards published his diary, and that's how he has become so well known today. Edwards was a pastor at a church at the time, and he was concerned that the rules to be a member of the church had been softened over the years, that just to live a good life was good enough to be able to take communion and things like that. So he looked at Brainerd and said, that's a changed life. Well, unfortunately for him, some of his parishioners looked at Brainerd's diaries and said, if that's what it takes, not for me, and they fired him. So the great Jonathan Edwards of the Great Awakening got fired from his church because he wanted his people to kind of mimic Brainerd's life. John Wesley looked at him as an example of a missionary. So even though John Wesley was in England and never met him, he looked at Brainerd's diaries and said, this is a missionary. And Edwards looked at it and said, this is a church member. And that's how they ended up getting a new minister after they fired him. All right. Should have put page numbers on these things. But Brainerd was a short life, 29 years, only 8 as a believer and 4 as a missionary. But his witness lives on in his journals that Edwards published after his death, which showed his devotion to Christ. His ministry was pretty impactful, changed a lot of the opinions of people at the time that Indians weren't just worthless heathens, that they could be saved. And he, like I said before, he established churches that had Indian pastors leading it, and the Indians themselves were the ones that were evangelizing to their own people afterwards. So he had a big impact there. So does anybody have any questions about David Brainerd? Yes.
John, you may not be able to answer this, I don't know. You know, a lot of what you talked about in the beginning was how depressed he was and how downtrodden he was and the frustrations that he went through and stuff. But then you got into, the success that the Lord allowed him to have with the Indians and all that. And I wonder, as all of these other great leaders of the faith read his diaries, was the impact a function of his submissive spirit in the early years, and he turned around and was more positive as he saw the Lord using him in a miraculous way? Or was he expressing his depression and all that all the way through his whole life, even at the time that the Lord was allowing him to have success in his ministry?
I think the first part, what you said first, is what happened. Although toward the end, his diary is like 1,500 pages long. I didn't read it all. But I cherry picked some of it, and I read some of the end, and he still would have these bouts of depression, but he was more upbeat, because of the success that he had with the Indians in New Jersey. But
Of course, the thorn in the flesh, he was dying of tuberculosis.
yeah, he was dying.
Yeah,
he was. And even when he was ministering to the Indians, he was coughing up blood. So he went pretty much until he couldn't go any further. And then he rode a horse back, 75 miles back to Edward's house afterwards, which was pretty remarkable that he could do that even. So, yes.
With what you said about his diaries and him being depressed and all that, to me it gives you hope. Because even though he was, broken and
Right.
all that you said, he was able to go on and do something outstanding.
Yeah.
So people who are depressed or, are weary or just, they feel like they're broken, can look through that, those 15 pages, and
Yeah.
just get the hook out of it,
Yeah.
too, I would think.
Yeah, I mean, his life, a lot of people could relate to it, not the exact circumstances, but just having depression and chronic illness and being able to accomplish all this in a short period, really. I mean, he was only 29 when he died. I think he was 8 years as a mission. No, 4 years as a mission, 8 years as a Christian. So he did a lot in those 4 years. And yeah, a lot of these other big guys in the faith pointed to that he was able to overcome so much adversity with the help of the Lord. Yeah.
It also speaks to the impact that people have that they don't realize, before they pass away.
Yeah.
I mean, he had, I'm sure, no idea the impact he was going to have from future evangelists. And I think that's true. I think a lot of us who, care for people and do the work of the Lord don't realize that, there's impacts that we don't see on the side of the grave.
Right.
And that's probably part of what was so encouraging for those folks that follow him. Looking through the lens of how little he knew and how depressed he was,
Right.
and the impact that he was having on others.
Yeah, he at the end said he gave, Edwards asked him for permission to publish his diaries just before he died, and he said, yeah, go ahead if you want to. But
One thing that his depression would do is keep him humble
yeah,
and dependent.
yep, for sure.
It seems like a lot of great people were having problems with depression occasionally, especially after the big victory. Then the letdown came. Like, was it the prophet Elijah after he slew all the prophets of Baal, after he said, Lord, now let me die?
Yeah, yeah.
Seems a pretty common thing.
Yep. Anything else? Well, if anybody asks you a question, if you've ever heard of David Brainerd, hopefully you can at least say, yeah, I've heard of him anyway. Yeah.
Who was that again?
Could you go back and repeat all that?
Yeah. All right. Well, that's all I have on him. Yeah, you're welcome. Yeah. Yeah.